The radar operator stared at his scope, certain the equipment had malfunctioned. October 14, 1951, 11:47 p.m., and the green phosphor traces showed aircraft approaching the Yalu River bridges at Sinuiju. But the speed readouts made no sense. Jets didn't fly at night. Nobody flew precision bombing runs in total darkness. The North Korean Air Defense Network had tracked American B-29 superfortresses for months, lumbering formations easy to intercept in daylight. Now something moved through the darkness at 450 knots, and the bridges were exploding. The Soviet advisors arrived within the hour, demanding to see the radar logs. Major Dmitry Karpikov had overseen MiG-15 operations since June, watching his pilots rack up bomber kills in afternoon sunlight. He understood jet combat, high-speed slashing attacks, visual identification, gun camera footage proving every victory. This made no sense. American jets had no night fighting capability. Their F-86 Sabres dominated in daylight dogfights, but retreated to bases after sunset like every other fighter in Korea. The damaged bridges and radar tracks told a different story. 3 nights later, it happened again. The scope showed 2 contacts, lower altitude this time, weaving between mountain valleys north of Pyongyang. The flight profile indicated bombing runs, but Soviet doctrine said this was impossible. Jets couldn't navigate terrain in darkness. They couldn't find targets without visual reference. They certainly couldn't deliver ordnance with any accuracy while blind. Yet the railroad junction at Kunuri was burning, twisted rails glowing orange against the November snow. Karpikov requested the wreckage reports. Ground crews found American bombs with standard fusing. No special night attack modifications, no parachute retardation, nothing explaining how pilots placed explosives on target coordinates they couldn't possibly see. The angle of impact suggested low-altitude release, perhaps 1,500 feet, exactly the altitude that would kill any pilot attempting it in total darkness over mountainous terrain. The Americans were either suicidal or had developed something Soviet intelligence hadn't detected. The pattern continued through November. Night attacks hit fuel depots, ammunition dumps, command posts, high-value targets requiring precise navigation and exact weapons delivery. Karpikov's MiG-15s sat idle on their airstrips, their pilots trained exclusively for daylight interception. The Soviet Radar 6M early warning system could detect the American jets, could track their speed and altitude, but the information arrived too late. By the time ground controllers vectored interceptors toward the contacts, the attackers had already struck and vanished into the darkness. Moscow demanded answers. The Americans had deployed something new, some technology that let pilots see through night and clouds, that turned darkness from a sanctuary into a hunting ground. Soviet engineers knew about British and German radar experiments from World War II. Primitive systems requiring dedicated night fighter aircraft with 2-man crews. Those were prop-driven interceptors, slow enough to manage bulky equipment and patient enough for ground-controlled approaches. The radar tracks from Korea showed single-seat jets performing attack missions with bomber-level precision, while flying faster than any night fighter in history. The intelligence reports filtering back to Moscow mentioned a designation, F3D. American pilots called it something else, Skynight. And whatever technology it carried was rewriting every assumption about air warfare the Soviets had built since 1945. Douglas Aircraft's El Segundo facility looked nothing like the gleaming research laboratories Stalin imagined were building American superweapons. Ed Heinemann's design team worked in a cramped converted warehouse surrounded by wooden mock-ups and hastily modified wind tunnel models. February 1946, and the Navy had just canceled their contract for the BTD destroyer dive bomber. Heinemann had 127 employees and no future projects. Then Commander Fitzhugh Lee walked in with photographs from Okinawa, B-29 wreckage scattered across runways, torn apart by Japanese night fighters the radar pickets never saw coming. The Navy wanted a jet-powered night fighter, carrier-capable, operational within 3 years. Heinemann's team had never built a jet. They had no experience with radar integration. The specifications demanded 2 engines for safety, 2 crew members to operate the equipment, and enough fuel capacity to patrol for 3 hours at 400 knots. Standard fighter design said this combination was impossible. Too heavy for carrier operations, too slow to catch enemy jets, too complicated for combat conditions. Heinemann started sketching anyway. The radar presented the biggest problem. Westinghouse had developed the AN/APQ-35, a prototype system that could detect aircraft at 15 miles and guide interceptions in total darkness. The equipment weighed 1,200 pounds, required its own cooling system, and generated enough electromagnetic interference to disrupt the aircraft's other instruments. Design engineer Herman Barkey spent 8 months just figuring out where to mount the radar dish without disrupting airflow over the wings. The solution, a bulbous nose cone that made the aircraft look pregnant, added 340 pounds of drag and reduced top speed by 40 knots. Test pilot George Jansen flew the F3D prototype on March 23, 1948. The radar operator's station sat behind him, facing rearward, surrounded by scopes and controls illuminated by red light to preserve night vision. Jansen reached 500 knots in level flight, respectable but not spectacular. The turning radius felt sluggish compared to the Navy's F-9F Panther dayfighter. But when radar operator Lieutenant Hugh Mackenzie powered up the AN/APQ-35 system, the scope showed clear returns on B-25 target drones flying 30 miles away, invisible in the California darkness. Korea changed everything. June 1950, and B-29s were getting slaughtered. The superfortresses flew night missions to avoid MiG-15 interceptors, but North Korean Po-2 biplanes, fabric-covered antiques from the 1920s, were shooting them down in the darkness. The B-29s carried tail guns, waist guns, top turret guns, all useless without visual contact. 12 bombers lost in 3 weeks. The Air Force requested immediate F-3D deployment, never mind that the Skynight was designed for the Navy, never mind that Douglas had only delivered 32 aircraft. Marine Squadron VMFN Vi-42 arrived at Kunsan Air Base in August 1952. The ground crews stared at the F-3D's ungainly profile, short wings, fat fuselage, engines buried in the wing roots like afterthoughts. Pilots called it the whale because it wallowed through the air, ponderous and slow. Maximum speed, 565 knots. The MiG-15 could hit 670 knots without trying, but strapped to the whale's belly was something the MiGs couldn't match. An AN/APQ-35 radar that could paint enemy aircraft through clouds, darkness, and 40,000 feet of altitude difference. Major William Stratton flew the first combat patrol on November 2, 1952. His radar operator, Master Sergeant Hans Hoagland, hunched over the scope in the rear-facing station, watching green traces bloom and fade as the system swept the sky. They were hunting, and the MiGs had no idea anything was watching them. William Henry never expected to make history. The 33-year-old Marine major from Oklahoma had flown Corsairs in World War II, propeller-driven fighters where combat meant seeing the enemy's canopy glint in sunlight before pulling trigger. November 2, 1952, 11:15 p.m., and Henry sat in F3D-2 Bureau, number 127016, climbing through 12,000 feet over the Yellow Sea. Behind him, radar operator Sergeant D.F. Mickey Moran watched the AN/APQ-35 scope, calling out ranges and bearings to contacts Moran couldn't see with his eyes, only with electrons bouncing off metal 30 miles away. The ground controller's voice crackled through Henry's headset. Bogies inbound, Vector 045, Angels 20. MiG-15s, returning from a strike on B-29s near Sinuiju. The communist pilots flew with confidence, knowing American fighters couldn't find them in the darkness. Soviet doctrine said night belonged to whoever controlled the searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries on the ground. The MiGs cruised at 20,000 feet, pilots relaxed, fuel gauges showing plenty of range to reach their base at Antung. Moran's voice cut through the static. Contact, 12 o'clock, 18 miles, closing. Henry pushed the throttles forward. The Westinghouse J-46 engines buried in the Skynight's wing roots spooled up, their whine inaudible to the MiG pilots ahead. 15 miles. 12 miles. The radar painted a clear picture. Single aircraft slightly below their altitude, no evasive maneuvers. The enemy pilot had no idea anything was tracking him. At 8 miles, Moran confirmed identification protocol. Solid return. Speed 480 knots. Altitude 92. Matches MiG-15 profile. Henry couldn't see anything. The moon had set an hour earlier. Clouds obscured the stars. Every instinct from his Corsair days screamed that closing on an invisible target at 500 knots was suicide. But the radar didn't lie. 6 miles. 4 miles. Moran guided him like a surgeon talking a patient through surgery, calm and precise. 3 miles, slightly left. Rate of closure good. 2 miles. Henry squinted into the darkness, still seeing nothing. The Skynight's 420 mm cannons were mounted in the belly, 800 rounds total. Enough for exactly one mistake before turning for home. 1 mile, dead ahead, level. Then Henry saw it. Not the MiG itself, but the faint blue glow from its exhaust, a ghost light against absolute black. Range, 900 feet. His thumb found the firing button. The cannons shredded the night. 20mm high-explosive incendiary rounds, 650 rounds per minute per gun. Converging at the point Moran's radar had predicted with mathematical precision. The MiG-15's aluminum skin didn't just tear, it vaporized. Fuel tanks ruptured. Hydraulic lines severed. The pilot never transmitted a distress call, never saw the tracers, never knew what killed him. The aircraft simply came apart, tumbling through 19,000 feet in pieces too small for radar to track. Henry pulled up, adrenaline making his hands shake. He'd just achieved something no pilot in history had accomplished. A jet shooting down another jet at night using only radar guidance. No visual contact until the final seconds. No searchlights, no ground control beyond initial vectors, no luck. Pure technology, American engineering, and one very good radar operator who'd kept his voice steady while guiding 2 tons of fighter through pitch darkness to within 900 feet of a target moving 480 knots. Moran's voice came through the intercom, professional as ever. Splash 1. Contact lost. Translation. Confirmed kill. Enemy aircraft destroyed. They turned for Kunsan, and William Henry became the first man to prove that darkness was no longer a sanctuary. The teletype machines at Soviet Air Defense Headquarters in Moscow clattered nonstop through November 1952. Major General Pavel Zhigarev read the reports with growing alarm. 7 MiG-15s lost in 2 weeks, all at night, all without warning, all without the pilots transmitting emergency calls. The Americans had named their weapon Skynight. Soviet intelligence designated it Object 52, and every loss revealed how catastrophically unprepared the VVS was for this kind of warfare. Zhigarev convened an emergency technical assessment at the Gromov Flight Research Institute on November 28th. Engineers spread reconnaissance photographs across conference tables, blurry images of the F3D taken from 30,000 feet by high-altitude photoplanes. The bulbous nose cone indicated radar, but Soviet designers had assumed American airborne intercept systems were years away from operational status. The British had Sea Venom night fighters, but those were subsonic, suitable only for bomber interception. The Skynight was engaging MiG-15s in combat and winning. Chief designer Semyon Lavochkin received orders on December 4th. develop a Soviet night fighter capable of matching the F-3D's capabilities within 18 months. Lavochkin's design bureau at Khimki already had a prototype, the LA-200, powered by two Klimov VK-1 engines and equipped with the experimental Tory-A radar system. The aircraft had flown exactly twice. Test pilot Andrei Kochetkov reported handling characteristics acceptable for experienced pilots in clear weather. That was engineering language for barely controllable. The Tory-A radar presented insurmountable problems. Soviet vacuum tube technology lagged American solid-state developments by 5 years. The system required 28 separate modules, each prone to failure, each requiring 45 minutes to repair, in climate-controlled facilities that didn't exist at forward air bases. Detection range: 8 kilometers in optimal conditions. The AN/APQ-35 in the Skynight could track targets at 24 kilometers. Lavochkin's engineers couldn't close a 3-to-1 performance gap in 18 months. They couldn't close it in 5 years. Meanwhile, in Korea, the F3D kill count climbed. January 11, 1953. Major William Stratton destroyed 2 MiG-15s in a single sortie, both at night, both radar-guided. January 30th. Captain James Weaver shot down a MiG-15 at 32,000 feet in total cloud cover. The enemy pilot never saw the ocean below or the fighter above. Soviet tactics evolved into desperation. MiG pilots received orders to land immediately after sunset. Night operations ceased entirely along the Yalu River. American B-29s resumed nocturnal bombing runs, unmolested, striking targets that had been untouchable 6 months earlier. The humiliation reached beyond Korea. Soviet air defense doctrine since 1945 had assumed radar belonged on the ground, in fixed installations with backup generators and trained crews. Mobile radar trucks could track aircraft, but interception required visual contact during final approach. The Americans had miniaturized an entire ground radar station into a 1,200-pound package that flew at 500 knots and guided cannon fire with precision Soviet engineers considered impossible. Lavochkin died of a heart attack in June 1960. His LA-200 program canceled after 14 prototypes. The Tory-A radar never achieved operational status. Soviet night fighter development shifted to the Yakovlev Bureau, which produced the Yak-25 in 1955, 3 years late, 200 knots slower than the Skynight, equipped with radar that still couldn't match American 1948 technology. By then, the F-3D had been retired from frontline service, replaced by even more capable aircraft the Soviets hadn't imagined possible. The Americans had opened a technological chasm, and every Soviet attempt to bridge it revealed just how wide that gap had become. Darkness, once the ally of defenders, now belonged to attackers who could see through it. The numbers told a story Soviet analysts refused to believe. Korean War final tally, July 1953. F-3D Skynights flew 2,800 combat sorties, lost 0 aircraft to enemy action, destroyed 6 MiG-15s and confirmed radar-guided night kills. Kill ratio 6.0. The MiG-15 was faster, more maneuverable, climbed better, and carried heavier armament. None of it mattered. Speed meant nothing when the enemy saw you first. Maneuverability couldn't counter attacks from invisible opponents. The Skynight had transformed air combat from a test of pilot skill into an equation of sensor range and reaction time. Marine Squadron VMFN 503 operated the Whale from K6 Air Base near Pyeongtaek through the war's final year. Maintenance crews hated the aircraft. The radar required 4 hours of pre-flight calibration. The vacuum tubes failed in humid conditions, and the complex cooling system leaked glycol at every seal. But when Major Joseph Corvey climbed into the cockpit for night patrol on March 12, 1953, those maintenance headaches translated into lethal capability. His radar operator, Technical Sergeant John Bowers, detected a formation of 4 MiG-15s at 22 miles, altitude 28,000 feet, heading south toward UN bomber streams. Corvée closed from below, the Skynight's black paint invisible against the dark yellow sea. The MiG flight leader never looked down. Soviet doctrine trained pilots to scan the horizon for engine exhaust, not to worry about threats from beneath. At 3 miles, Bowers confirmed target lock. At 200 feet, Corvée triggered a burst. The lead MiG's right wing separated at the root, hydraulic fluid misting into flame as the aircraft tumbled through 5 miles of altitude. The remaining 3 MiGs scattered, pilots screaming into radios, reporting impossible attacks from empty sky. The Skynight's success came despite performance that looked mediocre on paper. Maximum speed: 565 knots versus the MiG-15's 670 knots. Service ceiling: 38,000 feet versus the MiG's 51,000 feet. Rate of climb: 2,150 feet per minute versus the MiG's 9,840 feet per minute. The Skynight was slower, lower, and less agile. It didn't matter. The AN/APQ-35 radar gave it first look, first shot capability that negated every performance advantage Soviet fighters possessed. Technical Sergeant Robert Jacobs, a radar operator with VMFN 542, described the experience. We'd detect them 30 miles out, track their approach, position ourselves 5 miles ahead of their flight path, and wait. They never saw us. The radar painted them clear as day on the scope. Altitude, speed, heading, everything. We were hunting with night vision goggles while they stumbled around blind. The analogy was precise. Soviet pilots flew with Mark I eyeballs, scanning darkness for visual cues that didn't exist. American crews flew with electronic eyes that rendered darkness irrelevant. The implications terrified Soviet air defense planners. The Skynight was a 1948 design, barely adequate by American standards, already being replaced by more advanced systems. If this obsolescent aircraft could achieve total dominance over the VVS's best fighter, what would the next generation bring? Intelligence reports mention the F-3H Demon with improved radar, the F-4D Skyray with supersonic speed, and something called the F-101 Voodoo that combined both capabilities. Soviet interceptor development was trapped in 1945, building faster guns for dogfights that would never happen. The Korean armistice ended F-3D combat operations, but the lessons didn't fade. American pilots had proven that radar-guided night fighting worked, that all-weather interception was practical, that darkness amplified technological advantage rather than neutralizing it. The Skynight flew home with a perfect combat record, and Soviet engineers went back to their drawing boards, trying to catch up to technology the Americans had already surpassed. April 5, 1965, and Captain John Boyd's F-105 Thunderchief exploded over Than Hoa Bridge without warning. No visual contact, no radar lock alert, no time to evade. One moment he was screaming toward the target at 600 knots and 500 feet altitude. The next moment, a Soviet SA-2 guideline missile detonated 12 feet from his right wing, shrapnel shredding hydraulics and fuel lines. Boyd ejected at 480 knots, both legs broken, and spent the next 7 years in Hoa Lo prison. The F-105 wreckage scattered across rice paddies, testament to how completely Soviet radar technology had evolved since Korea. The SA-2 system wasn't sophisticated by American standards. A truck-mounted fan-song radar, 6 missiles per battery, effective range 25 miles. But it worked. North Vietnamese crews could detect low-altitude attackers, track them through evasive maneuvers, and guide missiles with 70-pound proximity-fused warheads. The Americans called it flying through a phone booth. The SA-2's kill zone was narrow, but if you entered it, survival was luck. Between 1965 and 1968, Soviet-built surface-to-air missiles shot down 110 American aircraft. The night fighting advantage from Korea had evaporated. Electronic warfare engineer Paul Hansen watched the loss reports pile up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base through the summer of 1965. The problem was obvious. American aircraft had no way to detect radar tracking until missiles were already in flight. Soviet fan-song radars operated at specific frequencies, S-band, between 2.7 and 3.5 gigahertz. Hansen's team at Applied Technology Inc. built the ALQ-71 radar warning receiver in 6 months, a system that screamed in pilots' headsets when fan-song illumination hit their aircraft. Range: 30 miles. Enough warning to begin evasive maneuvers before missile launch. Detection solved half the problem. Survival required jamming. The ALQ-87 jamming pod entered service in March 1966, a cigar-shaped cylinder packed with transmitters that flooded enemy radar screens with false returns. The system weighed 720 pounds, reduced aircraft speed by 40 knots due to drag, and consumed so much electrical power that pilots had to shut down non-essential avionics. But it worked. SA-2 kill rates dropped from 12% to 3% within 2 months. Soviet engineers responded with frequency agile radars that hopped between wavelengths faster than American jammers could track. American engineers countered with the ALQ-119 pod, which analyzed incoming radar signatures and generated targeted interference at exactly the right frequency. The electronic warfare spiral accelerated. Every Soviet advancement met with American counter-technology within months, each generation smaller, lighter, more effective than the last. Terrain masking became doctrine. Major Robert Dilger led strike packages through North Vietnamese valleys at 200 feet altitude, using mountains to block radar line of sight. The tactic worked until it didn't. SA-2 batteries repositioned to hilltops, firing down into valleys where American jets had nowhere to evade. Dilger's wingman, Captain Frank Tullow, died when a missile detonated directly beneath his F-4 Phantom on August 11, 1967. The aircraft disintegrated, too low for ejection, scattered across Highway 1 in pieces too small to recover. The lesson was brutal. Radar advantage had shifted. Soviet ground-based systems could now detect, track, and engage aircraft with accuracy that matched American airborne radars from Korea. Night provided no sanctuary. Clouds offered no concealment. Electronic warfare pods and evasive tactics reduced losses but couldn't eliminate them. American doctrine required a fundamental shift, from finding and shooting enemies in darkness to avoiding detection entirely, becoming invisible rather than just dangerous. That capability was coming, but in 1967 pilots were dying while engineers raced to invent it. The F-111 aardvark looked like something designed by committee compromise. Swing wings that pivoted from 16 to 72.5 degrees, side-by-side seating, escape capsule instead of ejection seats, and a nose packed with so much electronics the fuselage had to stretch to accommodate the weight. General Dynamics delivered the first production aircraft to the Air Force in October 1967, 2 years late, $2 billion over budget, and carrying technology that would redefine precision bombing. The key systems were buried in the weapons bay. On APQ-146 terrain-following radar and the paved tack targeting pod, each representing engineering breakthroughs Soviet designers hadn't imagined possible. Terrain-following radar let pilots fly at 200 feet altitude in total darkness, the system scanning ground contours ahead and automatically adjusting the aircraft's flight path to maintain constant clearance. Texas Instruments engineer Richard Core had spent 4 years solving the fundamental problem, distinguishing between mountains that required climb and valleys that allowed descent, all while processing returns at 500 knots where a 1-second delay meant hitting terrain. The AN/APQ-146 scanned 120 degrees forward, updated every 0.2 seconds, and provided terrain avoidance commands directly to the autopilot. Pilots called it flying by faith, because the cockpit windows showed nothing but darkness while the aircraft climbed and dove following computer commands. The paved tack pod solved the targeting problem. Ford Aerospace built the system around a gimbaled infrared sensor and laser designator, technology that detected heat signatures from 15,000 feet and guided weapons to within 3 meters of the aim point. Test pilot Major Roger Locker flew the first combat evaluation on September 28, 1972, against a bridge near Kep Airfield. The infrared display showed thermal contrasts invisible to human eyes. The bridge's concrete retained daytime heat, glowing white against the cooler river. Locker designated the target with a laser invisible to defenders, released a single 2,000-pound GBU-10 paveway bomb, and watched the weapon ride the reflected laser energy directly into the bridge's center span. The combination was devastating. Terrain-following radar meant F-111s could penetrate air defenses at altitudes too low for SA-2 missiles to track. Infrared targeting meant they could identify and strike targets in conditions where human eyes saw nothing. Laser-guided weapons meant they could hit with precision that turned every sortie into a guaranteed kill. The Americans had solved the problem that had plagued bombing since 1914, finding and destroying targets at night with accuracy that matched daylight operations. Vietnam deployment came in September 1972. The 6 F-111As of Harvest Reaper Detachment flew from Tak Ly Air Base in Thailand, striking North Vietnamese targets that had survived years of conventional bombing. Master Sergeant Donald Holmes, a weapons systems officer, described the capability. We'd cross into North Vietnam at 500 feet, radar showing every hill and valley, completely invisible to their defenses. The infrared pod painted targets clear as photographs. Vehicle parks, fuel dumps, ammunition bunkers, everything radiating heat. We'd designate, release, and be 20 miles away before the bomb hit. The Vietnamese never knew we were there until things started exploding. The F-111 wasn't perfect. Early reliability was terrible. Mission-capable rates below 50%. Terrain-following radar failures that killed 3 crews in training accidents. PAVTAC pods that overheated in tropical conditions. But when the systems worked, they demonstrated capabilities Soviet air defenses couldn't counter. The Americans had combined radar, infrared, laser guidance, and automatic terrain following into an all-weather precision strike platform that operated with impunity in conditions that grounded every other aircraft. The technology that started with the F-3D's bulky radar had evolved into something unrecognizable and unstoppable. January 17, 1991, 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time, and 66 F-111F Strike Eagles crossed into Iraqi airspace at 400 feet altitude, invisible to radar, guided by terrain-following systems that had matured through 2 decades of refinement. Captain Rob Givens flew jet number 70-2390. His weapons systems officer, Captain Tom Landis, hunched over the PAVTAC display, watching Iraq's desert glow in shades of infrared gray. Their target was the Taji Chemical Weapons Facility, 23 miles north of Baghdad, defended by 60 SA-2 and SA-3 missile batteries that had received 6 months of Soviet technical upgrades. None of it mattered. The mission planning had taken 11 hours. Givens and Landis studied satellite reconnaissance, memorized terrain features, programmed waypoints into the aircraft's inertial navigation system with precision measured in meters. The route twisted through river valleys and around known air defense sites, 340 miles of nap of Earth flying that kept them below radar horizons. Soviet doctrine assumed attackers would fly high to avoid terrain. The F-111's terrain-following radar made that assumption fatal. Iraqi air defense crews stared at empty scopes while American bombers screamed past 50 miles away, hidden by Earth's curvature. Landis acquired the target at 12 miles. The PAVTAC's infrared sensor painted the facility in thermal detail, hot machinery inside buildings, vehicle exhaust, human body heat from guards who had no idea what was coming. The GBU-12 Paveway 2 laser-guided bombs hung in the weapons bay, each 500-pound warhead capable of punching through reinforced concrete. Landis designated building coordinates, the laser invisible to Iraqi defenders, bouncing off target surfaces at a 186,000 miles per second. The bombs released at 8 miles range, guidance fins steering toward reflected laser energy with corrections every 0.1 seconds. 4 buildings disintegrated. The bombs entered through roofs, detonated inside, and collapsed structures from within. Givens banked hard right, terrain-following radar guiding them through a wadi at 380 knots and headed for the Saudi border. Time over target, 42 seconds. The Iraqi air defense network never detected them. No missile launches, no pour fire, no fighter scrambles. The Americans had attacked the heart of Iraq's chemical weapons program and vanished into darkness like they'd never been there. The pattern repeated for 43 days. F-111Fs flew 2,500 combat sorties, dropped 5,900 laser-guided bombs, achieved 94% direct hit rate against strategic targets. The statistics demolished Soviet air defense theory. The Americans weren't suppressing radar with jamming or overwhelming defenses with numbers. They were simply invisible, operating at altitudes and conditions where detection was impossible, striking with precision that turned every bomb into a guaranteed kill. Iraqi Major General Wafik al-Samarrai commanded air defense operations from a bunker in Baghdad. His post-war assessment, delivered to Soviet advisors in March 1991, was devastating. The Americans flew whenever they wanted, wherever they wanted, and we could not stop them. Our radars showed nothing. Our missiles could not lock. Our fighters never found them. They attacked at night as easily as daylight. They hit individual buildings, specific vehicles, precise coordinates. We had Soviet equipment, Soviet training, Soviet tactics. None of it worked. The F-111F losses in Desert Storm. 0 aircraft to enemy air defenses. The capability gap that started with the F-3D's primitive radar in 1952 had widened into a chasm. Soviet-equipped forces couldn't defend against American all-weather precision strike. They couldn't detect the attackers, couldn't track them, couldn't engage them, couldn't stop them. Night had become an American advantage so overwhelming it turned air defense into a futile exercise, burning fuel and ammunition while targets exploded and bombers escaped untouched. The Russian Federation's Ministry of Defense published an internal assessment in November 1992, declassified partially in 2003, that read like an autopsy of Soviet air defense doctrine. Colonel General Yevgeny Yurasov, who had overseen integrated air defense development since 1978, wrote the introduction. His conclusion was clinical and devastating. American night vision and precision guidance technology has rendered 45 years of Soviet air defense theory obsolete. We built systems to counter threats that no longer exist, while the Americans invented threats we cannot counter. The numbers told the story. Desert Storm. Coalition aircraft flew 109,276 sorties, lost 75 aircraft total, only 42 to Iraqi air defenses, a loss rate of 0.038%. The Iraqi air defense network was Soviet doctrine implemented perfectly. Overlapping radar coverage, mobile missile batteries, integrated command and control, fighter interceptors on alert, everything Moscow had designed to stop American bombers. It failed completely. The F-111s alone struck 1,500 targets with direct hits while flying exclusively at night, conditions where Soviet theory said precision bombing was impossible. The technological gap went beyond hardware. Yurasov's report documented the conceptual failures. Soviet designers had assumed radar belonged on the ground because miniaturization was impossible. The F-3D in 1948 had proven that assumption wrong. Soviet doctrine said all-weather attack required large formations dropping unguided bombs. The F-111's pave tack demonstrated that individual aircraft could hit individual targets through clouds and darkness. Soviet theory treated night as a sanctuary where defenders held advantage. American pilots treated night as preferred operating conditions where defenders were blind. The economic implications were catastrophic. The Soviet Union had spent 127 billion rubles between 1960 and 1990 developing air defense systems designed to counter B-52 formations bombing from 40,000 feet. The Americans had built aircraft that attacked from 400 feet using weapons Soviet designers hadn't anticipated. Every SA-2 site, Every SA-3 battery, every SA-5 long-range system was optimized for threats that didn't materialize while missing threats that did. Yurosov calculated that modernizing Russian air defenses to counter American all-weather precision attack would require 20 years and investment the collapsed Soviet economy couldn't provide. The training paradigm had failed too. Soviet pilots trained for daylight visual range combat, exactly the conditions Americans avoided. Soviet radar operators learned to track high-altitude formations, exactly the flight profiles Americans abandoned. Soviet air defense doctrine emphasized centralized control and coordinated response, exactly the organizational structure that couldn't react to low-altitude penetrators appearing and disappearing in seconds. The Americans had fought a different war than the one the Soviets had prepared for, and preparation meant nothing against an enemy who rewrote the rules. Yurosov's conclusion included a remarkable admission: we cannot close this gap through incremental improvement. American advantage in sensors, guidance systems, and all-weather operations represents fundamental technological superiority that Soviet industry cannot match in the foreseeable future. Our current air defense architecture is effectively obsolete against an adversary who possesses these capabilities. Translation: the Americans had won the Cold War's air warfare competition so decisively that even acknowledging the gap seemed pointless. The F3D Skynight had opened a door in 1952, proving radar-guided night combat worked. The F-111 had walked through that door 40 years later, with capabilities that made Soviet air defenses irrelevant. The Russians understood what had happened. Their pilots had been flying blind while Americans could see through darkness. Their missiles were optimized for wrong targets at wrong altitudes. Their entire defensive philosophy was based on assumptions the Americans had invalidated through engineering. Understanding didn't help. The gap was too wide, the technology too advanced, the defeat too complete.